Hey guys, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to place a hash ID in the URL to replace the record ID. So instead of it being article/1, it would be article slash a random string of letters and numbers. So one way to do this is to use the secure random class and use the URL safe base64 method. And what this does is it just generates a random string of letters and numbers right there. And you can actually pass it a number so that way you can make it 5 characters long. So I can show you what I mean by opening up the Rails console. So if I pass that in there, you just get this random string. But if I give it a number like 2 or 5, it's going to return a string with that amount of characters. So the first thing we want to do is let's exit out of the console. So the first thing we want to do is make a new column on our model, and what I'm gonna call it hash ID. You can call it whatever you want. So we're gonna do Rails generate migration add hash ID to articles. That's the name of my model in this case, and we'll call it hash ID, and it will be a string. So Rails G migration and hash ID to articles, just making sure that looks good. And let's open up the migration file to just make sure it looks good. Okay, so Rails DB migrate. Let's run that. Okay, and if you open up a schema, so we have this new column here. So now what we need to do is we need to actually set that value programmatically in our article model. So one way to do that is with a callback. So what I'm going to do is create a private method called set hash ID. And this is just going to automatically assign the hash ID of the record to the secure random call right here, and we will pass it in 5 to keep things relatively short. So we have this private method here, but we need to actually call it. So I'm going to call it on the before validation, and I'm going to call it before validation, but we're going to use a proc here, and we're going to use this proc because we only want to set the hash ID if the record does not have a hash ID yet. We don't want to keep changing the hash ID because what that'll mean is that eventually the hash ID is going to get placed into the URL. And if the hash ID changes every time we update the record or update the model, it's going to change the URL, and that's going to be inconsistent and cause broken links. So we want to set the hash ID if, and then create a new proc, and then we'll pass it in the article, and we're only going to do this if the article dot hash ID is nil. So right now, actually, all of the records in our database don't have a value set for the hash ID, and we'll take care of that in a minute. But let's open up the Rails console just to make sure that this is working right. So Rails C, and then I'm going to make a new article.new, and everything's nil. And then if I do a.save, a.reload, you can see that the hash ID was set. But then if I do like update title, updated, a.save, a.reload, the hash ID is still the same. So it didn't change just because we updated the record, and that's because we're passing it this proc here. Okay, so now we have a way to store the hash ID in the database, but we're still not actually doing anything useful with it. It's still just showing the ID in the URL. So one way to handle this is to just use friendly ID, and it just allows you to basically just replace the ID with something associated with your record. So it could be the title, it could be the body, it could be something else. In this case, we're just going to use the hash ID. So I'm going to copy this, go to my gem file. I'm going to shut down the server. Run bundle install. Okay, now let's look at the docs. So what do we got here? Bundle install. Okay, so now we need to add a slug column to our article table. So Rails generate migration, add slug to articles, and I'm gonna just copy and paste that. So Rails generate migration, add slug to articles. Do that, and then Rails generate friendly ID, and then finally run Rails DB migrate. And what this is going to do is it's going to, first of all, it's going to add a new column to our articles table. So now we have a slug column there, and then we have this join table where it'll store the value of the slug and the record ID, and basically friendly ID will just figure out which record belongs to which based on the parameters we give it. So the next thing we want to do is update our model. So I'm going to copy this in here, go to our article, and then we're not using a name field. In fact, we don't even have a name field on this model. We want to use the hash ID column. And finally, we want to make sure that our controller can use the friendly ID when it's finding the record. So article controller. Okay, so let's do that, and let's get our server back up and running. Okay, so now a few things you may or may not have noticed. So first of all, if I go to any of these records, it's still showing the ID and not the hash ID, and there's two reasons for that. One is we need to actually go in and update the hash ID for all of these records because they don't actually have a value yet. So we'll do that. Another thing though is that if I still make a new article, you'll notice that it is actually still showing the ID, and let's look into that. So if we do Rails C, and let's find that article find 12. So we can see here that it does have a hash ID, but it does not have a slug. And the reason for that is it has to do with the way friendly ID works. But basically, friendly ID, it automatically sets the value of the slug field before the record is validated. And the problem is we're running our own code here, and this is actually happening after friendly ID does its thing. So what's happening is friendly ID is looking for the value of the hash ID, but it hasn't been set yet. We do that during the before validation, and then the record gets saved, and since friendly ID didn't see anything in the hash ID column, it doesn't do anything, and then it just defaults to using the ID, which isn't great. So what we need to do is we need to prepend this callback, and what that does is it actually ensures that this will get called before friendly ID. So if I add prepend true and do that, now if I go and if I make a new article, so let's do this, testing, create article. Awesome. So now it actually ran and it's giving it a hash ID. But that doesn't take care of all of these previously added articles, which are still using the regular ID. Luckily, that's pretty easy to fix. We just have to go through each of our records and save them. And we can do that simply by going in and finding all the articles and just resaving them. And I actually did this previously, but if you go back to your application, you should see that they're all now using the hash ID in the URL instead of the actual ID.